This session focuses on changes in behaviour that you might see as out of character for the person that you're caring for, and also on the importance of prioritising your own well-being in being able to care for someone with dementia in the longer term. In part 1, we're looking at identifying the new changing behaviours that you might have noticed, and in beginning to make the distinction between what we call frontal and situational behaviour change. In part 2, we'll be thinking about what it might feel like to have dementia and trying to work out how to identify triggers to situational changes in behaviour. In part 3, we'll be focusing on the experience of caring for someone with dementia, identifying symptoms of stress and their impact on your ability to act in a way consistent with your values as a carer. And in the final part, we'll be looking at ways to de-stress and on the importance of prioritising your own needs in order to avoid burnout. So all behaviour happens for a reason. Now, all of us have needs, and typically we can tell people what we need or how we feel. Obviously, we don't always do this. Sometimes we do expect other people to tell how we can feel by our behaviour, but we are able to explain ourselves. Whereas for people with dementia, as the dementia progresses, their ability to explain themselves, to express themselves, to tell other people about what they need does decline. And so instead, we might have to be the ones who work out from the person's behaviour how they're feeling and what they need. So in this session, when we're asking you to think about new or changing behaviour on your relative, we're not so much meaning things like forgetting names, getting lost, losing things. It's more around what the person's character and personality was like before. Are they reacting in ways that are different and you wouldn't have expected them to behave in that way in the past? When in previous sessions we've asked people to identify examples of new or changing behaviours in their relatives, these are some of the things that they've come up with. Now you'll see that some of them are quite different. For instance, one person might speak of their relative being resistive of help and advice, and another might say that their relative is more compliant. One person might say that the person they care for tends to blame other people, whereas someone else might be too trusting. It's not an exhaustive list. It certainly doesn't mean that everyone with dementia will exhibit these kinds of behaviours, but they're the kind of behaviours that we will be thinking about in this session. And I've already touched on this in the previous slide, but just as a reminder, every person is different. They have a different character, a different intellect from the next person. Their life experiences may be quite different, as well as the type of dementia they have and the extent that it's progressed. And each individual will be influenced by their own physical health, whatever physical health conditions that may be accompanying the dementia, and what's going on in their home and other lifestyle factors. So it's not surprising that the changes brought about by dementia are experienced and progress in a different way for every person. If you remember, in an earlier session we talked about the fact that many people have known someone with dementia and therefore might have an expectation that your relative is going to be the same. You might face a question like, has your relative started to get aggressive yet? So it's worth looking at, does dementia inevitably lead to changes in personality and behaviour? It is the case that if the front part of the brain is damaged, then there are certain changes in behaviour that will go with that. So it's worth looking at to what extent is the frontal lobe, the front of the brain, affected in different types of dementia. Now in frontotemporal dementia, the clue's in the name. This is a rarer type of dementia. represents only 5% of all diagnoses of dementia, and yes, the frontal lobe is typically damaged early on, so part of the diagnostic signs are specific changes in behaviour. Whereas in Alzheimer's dementia, which is the commonest dementia, and in Lewy body dementia, certainly in the early stages the frontal lobe is much less implicated. Now, as far as vascular dementia goes, that's going to depend, because if you remember, that's caused by problems with the blood supply to the brain, so it's going to depend where the blockages or the leaks in the blood supply to the brain have occurred as to what extent the frontal lobe may be affected. So what do personality and behavioural changes that are a direct consequence of damage to the front part of the brain, what do they look like? Well, a person can become either really quite hyperactive or the opposite, quite passive and withdrawn. They may become compulsive, that is, really wanting to keep to very set routines, doing the same things at the same times every day and getting stress if they can't do that. Another possibility is that they become quite blunt and what seems like rude remarks that are really quite out of character for them. They might start to comment on other people's appearance to their face, that kind of thing. And typically they might begin to appear, and it's been described to me as in their own bubble, so really finding it difficult to appreciate how another person is feeling. And then people with dementia are likely to be having to cope with much more than just memory loss. Maybe they are losing some of their practical skills, cookery, DIY, that kind of thing, which is maybe leading to a loss of the role that they once had within the family. Maybe they are either unable to carry out some of their hobbies and interests or unable to get there because of difficulties with driving. And that might lead to loss of friendships that were part of those hobbies and interests. And generally, a loss of peace of mind with that sense of what's going to happen next. Loss of intimacy can be a big thing, and we're going to be talking about that on a later slide. And generally, a loss of a sense of who they are and a confidence in what they're able to achieve. When we run post-diagnostic support groups for people with dementia and encourage them to talk about any changes they might have noticed in the way other people treat them, these are some of the things they've said to us. As soon as the doctor said I had dementia, my family wanted to take over my life. It's often a reaction. Families have an idea of what dementia is and assume that the person can't cope at all, rather than stepping in only when needed. She talks to me as if I was a child. It's really difficult, isn't it? The roles are changing. You have to be more supportive, but to try and make it still feel like an adult-to-adult conversation. They've taken away my car. That's always a big one if people aren't able to drive and lose that sense of independence and role that they've always had. He says I keep repeating myself, so I try not to say much now. I remember that being said. It displayed an insight in the lady that said it, and a feeling that she didn't want to be in this situation and causing a nuisance to others. They make decisions without consulting me. Now that's a big one, and often families have discussed decisions before arriving at a conclusion, but that doesn't mean that people won't still feel this, because they may have forgotten that consultation, and then the decision starts to be played out and they feel as though they haven't been consulted. I know they mean well, but I want to do things for myself. That sense of wanting still to be useful is such a big one, and still to have purpose. So it really isn't surprising that certain changes in behaviour might occur specific to certain situations and triggered by how a person's feeling in that moment. So behaviours like becoming irritable or even angry in a certain situation. Anger is a defence against deeper feelings of shame and upset and embarrassment, all of those sorts of things. Being obstinate and refusing help. You saw those comments like, I can do it for myself, I want to do it for myself. Becoming suspicious, accusatory and blaming. One of the exercises we've done in the past is to get people to think about a time when they lost their car in a car park, a very common experience for many people. And it's amazing how quickly people come to the thought that their car had been stolen. It's what we do if we can't find something that we expect to find in a certain place and we can't remember having moved it, etc. Someone else must have moved it, someone else must have stolen it. Being clingy and following you around. I imagine that if you're feeling vulnerable and insecure, you want to hold on to someone who makes you feel safe. Being unwilling to go out or wanting to come home shortly into a visit. Again, that's likely to be around feeling acutely uncomfortable or unsafe in certain scenarios. So how to tell the difference between changes in behaviour that arise directly from damage to the front part of the brain and the situational behavioural changes? And is that important anyway? Well, new behaviours that arise directly from changes in the front part of the brain, so the ones that we talked about, they being compulsive, maybe being hyper or particularly passive and withdrawn, maybe being rude and insensitive and in your own bubble, those tend to be the case all the time. And you're unlikely to be able to change those behaviours. It's more a case of finding ways to manage them, as we've discussed in a previous slide. But some behaviours are changeable. So sometimes people are very cheerful and happy and amenable one minute and then angry and resistant to help another. Or perhaps they're calm and relaxed at one point and then anxious and agitated at another. So those changeable behaviours are much more likely to be situational, much more likely to be triggered by what's happening in the moment and how that's making the person feel. So this is much more interesting because if you can then put yourself in the person's shoes, and we'll be looking at how to do that, it may be possible to make a real difference that will benefit you and benefit the person that you're caring for.